Good morning, everyone, and good morning, everybody virtually. We're going to start this morning off with this panel. This is on PFAS investigation, and Joe Applegate with Geosyntec is going to lead this. Joe is also on the steering committee, and it's been a wealth of information in this whole arena. So I'm going to turn it over to Joe, and we'll get going with this morning's program.
Good morning, everybody. My name's Joe Applegate. I'm a professional geologist with Geosyntec up in Tallahassee. Been practicing for about 35 years. I started with DEP back in 1986, fresh out of grad school. And we talked a lot about different programs in the last session yesterday, brownfields, dry cleaning, petroleum. 1986 was when Super Act started. And a lot of people were in the Bureau of Waste Cleanup, Bureau of Operations at the time, leaped over to this new shiny program, PRP. So left a huge hole for all the CERCLA, Superfund site management. So I got to cut my teeth on that for about 4 years. Back in the 80s, early 90s, we were starting to worry that in 20 or 30 years, we might run out of work. So we better get it done while we could. So petroleum came around, and then dry cleaning program came around in 96, brownfields, and then emerging contaminants. So there's still about 7,000 petroleum sites to be cleaned up. That's about $3 billion worth of cleanup. There's still 1,100 dry cleaning sites left. That's probably another billion or two. And now we've got PFAS. So I think for early practitioners coming into the industry, there's going to be plenty of work for the next 30 years. Today's topic is PFAS investigations. I gave a presentation to Marco Island in 2019. I think that was my last conference I attended. And when I started, I asked the audience, how many people have heard of PFAS? And there was probably 100 people in the room. Less than half raised their hands. And I was just floored that nobody had heard of PFAS. And I want to thank Gene for starting this PFAS forum. It's very timely. So a whole conference. And there was only one presentation on PFAS at that Marco Island in 2019. So I think that was kind of the start of it. So without further ado, we've got a lot of great presentations on various topics on PFAS. I would like to point out, somebody mentioned ITRC yesterday. They've got an excellent guidance document from background of PFAS compounds to assessment to remedial alternatives. So that's a really good guidance. EPA has clue in. And of course, anybody practicing in PFAS in Florida needs to be familiar with the DEP PFAS SOQs, which are regularly updated. I'm going to briefly introduce all the panelists. There are bios, as Gene mentioned, in the program, so be sure to look at that. First, we've got Nick Albergo. Nick is a rock star in the environmental industry. He's been practicing way longer than I have. He led and helped found Florida Remediation Conference. He's an adjunct professor at USF, and he's contributing authors on ASTM standards for ESAs, which he's going to talk about, PFAS implications for environmental site assessments. Second, we have Taryn McKnight. She's the PFAS practicing lead for Eurofins Test America. Got over 20 years experience, and I've presented with Taryn many times at conferences, so she's going to talk all about analytical methods for PFAS. Third is Dr. Dylan Eberle. He's with Geosyntec out of Acton, Massachusetts. He's going to be virtual today. He's an expert in characterization, emerging contaminants, innovative remediation, and he's going to talk about PFAS forensic techniques and fingerprinting PFAS sources. Fourth, we've got Lucas Barroso. He's a senior environmental engineer, heads up the engineering department for Terracon down Miami Lakes, has over 20 years experience. He's going to talk about the investigation of PFAS at Miami-Dade College Fire Academy. Look forward to that. And we saved the best for last with a dual combo. We've got Fabio Fortes and Nick Barnes, both engineers with HSW here in Tampa. And they're going to be talking about site assessments and conceptual site models. Now, I'm a geologist and these two are engineers. I'm not so sure why we got engineers working on geologists territory, but we'll see how it goes. So with that, Nick, take it away.
Jesus, man, am I getting fucking old? I'm sharing the stage with students that I've had. So freaking old I am. I'm nervous. I'm Nick Albergo. You're not. I'm not an alcoholic. They go to meetings. So anyhow, I was one of the primary authors of the phase 1 standard back in the early 90s. Our first standard came out in 1993. It sucked. We quickly changed it in 1994 and it's been evolving. We've got the latest standard coming out this year, the 2021 version. So I'll give you a little tidbit at the end. So as PFAS has now started to emerge, it's a big deal. As you can imagine, it's also showing up in phase 1s. And the question is how you handle them in phase 1s. And the reality is that, the short answer is you can do just about any way you want. And I'll talk about what those ways are. But I think the bottom line is we're probably 3 to 5 years out before I think there's enough of a hammer in terms of regulatory enforcement and money to start to drive these emerging contaminants. So I think it's great that we have this kind of conference, but I think the reality is, we're still a ways out to actually see it hit the ground and start making you guys some money. If we take a bit of a step backwards, I can't see a damn thing, by the way. So I'm going to have to do this completely blind unless I leave the microphone. So let me see if I can at least see a little bit. You know what? I'm going to come down here. My voice is loud enough.
Yeah, time out. Stop. You got virtual people.
Oh, there's virtual. Sorry. So you may have gotten a little bit of this already, but it's important in terms of talking about the phase 1 because the phase 1 is a CERCLA-driven document, right? The entire reason that standard exists was for one thing, and that was to satisfy what ultimately became one of the 3 landowner liability defenses to CERCLA. So we all recognize that 9 out of 10 phase 1s in this country are done that have nothing to do with CERCLA. They're for all other sorts of reasons, but that's not how it was designed. So if we look at what's going on, basically we're still not to the point where we're calling these things carcinogens. EPA is not ready and Congress is not ready to dump it into the hazardous substances category. And without those things, while emerging substances like these are going to be of concern, there's no hook necessarily to drag them into a document like phase 1 because it's so CERCLA driven. Now, there's been attempts, as you know, over the last couple of years. In 2020, there was an attempt to say, hey, listen, we need to drive forward, establish some MCLs. And of course, EPA was like, how the hell are we supposed to do that? We don't have enough data to know what we're doing yet. So it kind of died out pretty quickly. The National Defense Authorization Act also talked about DOD having to take on some responsibility for their facilities. But here again, without CERCLA liability, it didn't mean much. So we've got about a 5-year history going on right now, right? 2016, we finally kind of established this target level of 70 parts per trillion through all of the emerging contaminants into the same basket and moved on. And now more recently this year, finally EPA is going to start monitoring water treatment plants at their own expense now to start seeing what these chemicals look like, what kind of concentrations we have. So that's kind of where we're at in terms of the government, the federal government. There's also an effort now to protect firefighters, which is good. That's actually moving forward. But when we get to talking about remediation, there's been an effort now in March of this year to say, hey, once again, we're going to try to revive these bills. One of the bills has to do with establishing an MCL, which they keep trying to push, but they really don't have the backing to pull it off. They obviously would love to get PFAS into circular hazardous substance list, but politically that's going to be a big, big challenge. So if we look at where we're at state by state, there are some states that have embraced the 70 part per trillion, others that are above, below. Some states like Michigan have actually gone to the point of talking about establishing an MCL, and that's going to wind up being important for us for the phase ones. And if we look at locally, Florida, we had two very nice bills this year. Both were killed April. And the first one was going to establish a assessment and site rehabilitation program with the DEP. And the other one was going to give some immunity to the airports. Both were presented this year. Both were killed on the same day. So, you know, we're trying at both the federal and the state level. But as I said, you're years out, I think, before this thing actually hits the ground. So how does all this come into play with phase ones? Well, the simple answer is it's not a wreck because it's not a circular hazardous substance. It's not a petroleum product. That's it. Okay. So you can go that direction if you want and let it be at that. But most people aren't happy with that answer, especially if you've got clients or folks that actually would like some comments about this stuff. So, okay, so you don't like the not a wreck answer. Well, maybe we can do something else. Why don't we just treat PFAS the same way we did petroleum? You know, we pulled petroleum into the phase one standard and it wasn't a circular hazardous substance. And the idea was, well, it's becoming good and customary practice to look for these things, especially if you're at, you know, firefighting site at airport and so forth. So why not do we take that same angle that we did with petroleum and look at possibly pulling it in? Well, one of the challenges with that is it's not part of the standard, but I'll take care of that in a moment. So maybe what we do is we start to look at the local agency interview, which is part of the phase one process, and say, listen, probably the most important thing you can do during that interview, if you're looking to comment or opine about emerging contaminants, is to find out what the local state regulations are. Have they established some limits? Are they doing any sort of enforcement? Are they doing any permitting? Is there anything going on that suggests in that locale that emerging contaminants are not just a concern, but something's being done? And if that's the case, then it's possible you can throw PFAS right into the REC category, recognized environmental condition. Why? Just like petroleum products, first and foremost, it may be a facility that's obvious. And we know CERCLA says if you're doing due diligence, you've got to identify those things that are obvious. So if it's a fire training facility, as an example, well, that's obvious. If it's a state that's established MCLs or is doing some sort of governing, well, that's good commercial and customary practice in that area. There's no problem with identifying that there's been a release and it's not de minimis because of the second point and the first point. If the government's doing something about it, it can't be de minimis by definition. And so the idea is, if you really want to shove it into the REC, you probably could. I'm not sure you want to, but I could see an avenue of doing it and being able to justify it. Now, bottom line is, I don't think either of these two scenarios are all that great. So we're left with the third one. And that's that we've got something called business environmental risk within the standard. It's not a part of the standard, but the idea is, by the way, someone has to cut me off so that we don't, I don't screw up the whole day. I'm a professor, so I talk and I don't care whether the kids like it or not. But with you guys, I actually, make sure, all right. How am I doing on time? Okay. 10 minutes. All right. I can certainly bullshit that long. No one will know anything. Even if I don't know what I'm talking about, I'll come up with something. So the idea, if we're going to go in a completely different direction, business environmental risk, we're going to have to create, what does that avenue look like? I give you the rec avenue, I give you the no rec avenue. So, well, what we can do is treat PFAS as a contractual matter. So if we've got a user, a client, who's either interested in that, or it's a facility that you as the consultant are concerned about because of the potential for these things, well, there's a way to do it. First and foremost, we tell you in the standard that it was written as a circular-driven document, but it doesn't have to be used that way. In fact, we acknowledge at ASTM that pretty much all the phase ones are rarely driven by landowner liability protection. I mean, CERCLA's dead. It's got no money. So what is it that people are looking for? Well, the banks want them. They're concerned about their risk of development, diminution in value, stigma. There's all sorts of reasons why people do phase ones. It's got nothing to do with the protection necessarily. So the idea is we can take that document and in coordination with our clients say, listen, we're using the ASTM phase one, but we're going to call it a phase 1+. We're going to add a couple non-scope things, just like you would lead-based paint, just like you would do asbestos in a 100-year-old building. It's not technically part of a phase one, but we're going to stick it in there. And so it's just an additional service, and that works out really well. And because we have something called business environmental risk defined within the standard, and we talk about how you can use it, that if you have a client that's willing to allow for business environmental risk to be opined on within the document, why not do it? Then that's your way out. And that's scenario 3, is basically at the option of the user, and as a contractual matter, you can say it's not a REC because it's not a circular hazardous substance or petroleum product, okay? But it's also it's not a REC that way, but we also don't like the idea of calling it a REC for exactly the same reasons. But we can give you some valuable information as a business environmental risk. Now, some clients don't like business environmental risk because it opens the barn door a bit. And so what they'll do is, Howard here? No. So Howard's a good example. He hates the damn things. So what you do is you don't put them in the conclusions or executive summary, but you're still allowed to put them in your opinion section because that's your opinion. And so that would be a way of staying true to the standard and yet taking care of your concerns as a consultant, as well as any concerns that the user or client might have. So what we've done in 21 now, knowing that this thing, once we publish this year, it's going to be out there for 7 years, and we anticipate PFAS and other emerging contaminants to be at the forefront over the next 7 years, is we're essentially saying what I've told you up till now, which is they're not technically part of the standard, but we understand that many people that aren't in the know like you all, that are non-environmental professionals, might assume that these things are going to be part of the standard because they are hazardous substances, even if they're technically not. And so we recognize that that's a problem. There's going to be a disconnect where people are presuming that you added or that you talked about these things, and they're surprised to find out that you didn't. And so our concept is, if you've got that situation, then all we're asking is that you can provide that analysis, but that you discuss it with the user in the event they don't want it. There's a situation at Tampa International right now where one of the FOBs, is that the right, is that right? The fixed base operation, FBO, right? Fixed based operations for the little rich planes. The Lears and stuff that come in, they don't go to the regular airport, right? They go to a FBO, and they're trying to build, right, isn't that right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and I fucked it up, that's all right. The idea is that they were expanding, they wanted to put in 2 more hangars. They didn't need some report that starts talking about PFAS and screwing up their deal because they just were leasing a couple more places. So they were like adamant, don't you even start with that crap in my phase 1, right? Doesn't belong, you're gonna screw up my deal, right? And I understand that completely. So as a contractual matter, that's where we're at. So the bottom line is that as far as a phase 1's concerned, I think you can make an avenue and make an argument for all 3 ways. It's a rec, it's not a rec, it's a business environmental risk. So it just depends on what your user, what your client is interested in, and then what your personal concerns are from a technical standpoint based on the use or uses of the property, and whether or not that's something that you're very concerned about, right? So I don't recommend we start worrying about, you know, plastic food containers and freaking out in landfills, right? But if it's a facility where they're doing firefighting training and so forth, it's more likely that we're going to have a problem. I got nothing else to say. Any questions? Perfect. Thank you so much. It's been my pleasure. I'll go back to work now. I'm going to be watching you guys.
I appreciate the candidness and the 3 options we have for phase 1 now. It was a big discussion in the last session last night, so clarified things great. So next up is Taryn McKnight. We'll talk about analytical methods for PFAS compounds.
Okay, well, hopefully that talk woke you guys up and you can pay attention to the chemistry talk now. Okay, so I'm gonna talk about how we navigate our analytical method options for PFAS, which is complex and sometimes convoluted. But before we dive into those considerations, I just want to remind folks, we always have to start with answering the question, what are the data being used for? Are they used to meet compliance, to support litigation or due diligence, to measure efficacy of a treatment process? These all have different considerations. And so that's where the analytical toolbox comes into play. Which ones are we going to apply in which order? And then just keeping in mind that these are, these examples I've given here are historically pretty well defined for us, what that process looks like. But with PFAS, it's not, right? The regulations are scattered, lots of gaps. The legal space is challenged because the regulations and the science are still playing catch up. Even with treatment, you may think it's as simple as measuring what goes in and what comes out, but it's challenged by the same things as the legal space. We don't have the regulation. What are we testing for? What limit are we testing to? So with that in mind, let's dive into the options. First, we'll start with the EPA standard methods, which right now only apply to drinking water. So for the last 10 years or so, it was pretty straightforward. We had a single drinking water method, 537.1. But then at the end of 2019, things got a little complicated with the addition of EPA method 533. And they got complicated because they're 2 different methods. 533 didn't replace 537.1. So you have to make a decision as a practitioner, which method are you going to use for potable water? Or are you going to use both? For example, these 2 methods cover some of the same analytes, but they also cover different analytes. So what do you do with that information? How do you decide which analytes you need to cover for your site? So then we move on to talking about non-standard and draft methods for everything else that's not drinking water. So what if you need to collect fish tissue, soil, biosolids, landfill leaching, groundwater, air? None of these are covered by the EPA published methods right now. So what do we do? What if you want to address additional analytes besides the 29 that are covered by the drinking water methods? So to answer that question, we got to take a little walk down memory lane and look at the timeline. So back in the year 2000 is when we started measuring for PFAS in the environment. And those methods were based off the manufacturer's methods, the companies who made these chemicals. And they were defined as user-defined methods. They were certifiable under method reference 8321. That's just a catch-all method for anything that uses LCMS technology. You can use it for herbicides, explosives, PFAS, any number of constituents. So needless to say, not prescriptive at all to PFAS. And then in 2008, the EPA publishes their first method, the drinking water method, 537, and ISO publishes 25101. This method only applies to PFOA and PFOS. It's only for non-potable water. It has reporting limits that are higher than a lot of screening levels and action limits today, and it's not prescriptive at all. In early 2016, this is when things start to heat up in the PFAS world. So we get the results of the UCMR3. The EPA sets their lifetime health advisory limits, and the DoD takes sweeping action to address PFAS in drinking water at military installations around the country. So by late 2016, stakeholders start indicating that a user-defined method is no longer sufficient. They need an EPA reference method. So this is where we see the emergence of 537 modified, which was a particular point of contention for the EPA for quite some time, because drinking water methods don't lend themselves to modification. So it's kind of an oxymoron. But it wasn't modified for drinking water. It was modified to apply it to all the non-drinking water matrices. And it was given that name in the absence of an EPA method to reference. Then in 2017, the Department of Defense addresses PFAS in their quality systems manual for the first time in table B15. And EPA Region 5 releases 2 different methods for PFAS in non-potable water and solid matrices under ASTM. In 2018, EPA updates their drinking water method to version 537.1. They simply added a few compounds to the list. And 2019, they add the drinking water method 533, and they release a draft version of 8327, which I'll talk a little more about in a moment. And then at the beginning of this year, at the end of a pandemic, nonetheless, they get out a new method for PFAS and source air emissions, OTM 45. So this shows you the current methods that are actually available, published for use today, and then these future methods that are being worked on, so not available yet. On the top, you can see the 2 drinking water methods and the source air method. And then for the future methods, we've got that draft 8327 that has not been published yet. And there's been a little bit of confusion about this method. So it was released for public comment in the summer of 2019. Oh boy, it looks like I got a little happy with the copy and paste. So 8327 is only for non-potable water, not for solids. So it was released for public comment. It received a lot of criticism for not meeting certain data quality objectives. It was characterized as a rapid screening tool. It doesn't align with current best technologies or methods or what current commercial laboratories support and have been for decades. So even once it is finalized and released, it's not expected to be widely adopted as written. What the industry is waiting with bated breath for is a future method, a 1600 series method. It's being developed in collaboration between the EPA and the Department of Defense. And it'll address non-potable water and solid matrices. It'll cover 40 PFAS compounds. It'll meet the Department of Defense data quality objectives, and it's in line with what commercial laboratories have been doing for years. So you're going to see consistency in the data from what they've been doing to when they transition and adopt the new EPA standard method. And then the EPA has been working on some other types of air methods, ambient air and vapor. So right now, for the non-potable water and solid matrices, what we've all been using is a user-defined method. You might see this referred to as anything from 537 modified, 537 isotope dilution, laboratory's SOP number. But just to really drive the point home, I wanted to include this slide. So as far as looking at the different types of matrices out there, if it's drinking water, it's one of these 2 EPA published methods. If it's any of these other matrices, it is predominantly being supported by a user-defined method. Whether that method's based off of 537, 533, ISO, ASTM, it's been modified by that laboratory to support those constituents in those matrices. So as you can imagine, that leaves people feeling a little uncomfortable, especially regulators and attorneys. So what have we done about this across the states? We've developed program criteria to try and address that potential variability across these user-defined methods. And right now, a go-to has been the Department of Defense Quality Systems criteria. So whether you ever touch a federal site or not, this may be applicable to you in states like California, Colorado, Alaska, New Hampshire, Arizona. They're defaulting to requiring the DoD QSM criteria to ensure that they're getting defensible and comparable results from lab to lab. And then for those states that chose not to adopt the DoD QSM criteria, they've developed their own method criteria. So how PFAS data are generated in New Jersey is different than how they're generated in Wisconsin. So as you can imagine, the downside of all of this is this does nothing to improve consistency or reduce variability across state lines. And as part of all of this method development efforts going on, the target analyte list is constantly changing, typically growing. The EPA's draft target lists have evolved over the years from 6 to 21 to 24 to 28. Now their future method is targeting 40 PFAS. Different states have carved out their own compound lists that are required, 33 in Wisconsin, up to 42 in California. So again, just variability after variability from state to state. And there's an appetite right now, certainly, for capturing more PFAS compounds just for the sake of more. But there's also some value in looking for additional subgroups of PFAS chemicals. So depending on the types of chemicals that you look at, you can start to tease out differences in sources, understanding faint transport mechanisms. And so that kind of leads us into the next discussion about emerging technologies. So we're going to transition away from looking at regulated compounds and standard methods and look at some of the emerging technologies that help us answer and fill in some of the data gaps. We have a preparation technique. It was referenced yesterday. It's called the Total Oxidizable Precursor Assay, or TOP assay. The specific benefit of this tool is that it looks at part of that unknown mass of PFAS that we can't identify the individual compounds for. And it converts them rapidly and tells you the dead end daughter products that they can convert into in the environment. So you have these polyfluorinated, incompletely fluorinated chemicals. They're subject to biotransformation under regular environmental conditions, and they can eventually turn into your risk drivers, PFOA, PFOS, PFHXS. So wouldn't you like to know that now, today, rather than 12 months from now after it has time to happen naturally in the environment? So that's the point of the TOP assay. And one particular benefit of it is that it's a preparation technique that's combined with our standard methods. So it has sensitivity in that single-digit part per trillion range. What the TOP assay is not is also important to understand. This is not a risk assessment tool. You cannot plug this data into a risk assessment model. This just gives you an idea of that potential future risk that could be at a site. It also does not capture all of the unknown PFAS. It only captures the oxidizable precursors. So it doesn't get us all the way there to that full picture of the total unknowns. And I just wanted to clarify something. There was a little misinformation yesterday about what are precursor compounds. So something was said about compounds, short chain compounds like PFBS having the potential to turn into long chain compounds like PFOA. And that's not the way it works in the environment. So it's the longer, incompletely fluorinated chains that turn into the shorter, completely fluorinated chains. So some of you might be thinking, well, what about the rest of that unknown mass of PFAS? Can we capture it? Well, we can get pretty close anyways. There's a method called total organic fluorine, or TOF. And so it's like it sounds, gives you a total fluorine number representing that total unknown mass of PFAS. So it gets you pretty close to that mass balance. The real downside is the sensitivity of this methodology. So it's going to get you to just about a part per billion in water. So that would be a very useful tool at a contaminated site for site delineation. Many AFFF impacted sites would fall into that category, but this isn't going to tell you if you've got this unknown mass of PFAS down in that part per trillion range. So that's still a gap in our analytical tool belt that we don't have an answer for. And then lastly, we have non-target analysis. So non-target analysis is accomplished using some pretty high-end sophisticated instrumentation and techniques. It's called a QTOF instrument, or a quadrupole time of flight. A lot of researchers use this, like Dr. Mark Schreiner at the EPA, to try and identify those unknown PFAS, to put a face and a name to them. So if you're familiar with some of the case studies done at like Fayetteville, North Carolina, at the Chemours plant, where they discovered Gen X, which was the replacement for PFOA, that was done on an instrument like this. Some of the studies at West Virginia, Parkersburg, and New Jersey at manufacturing facilities, where they're looking at what's emitting from those facilities, there are all these replacement compounds that the EPA doesn't know about. We don't have a face or a name to them. So you can use this kind of instrumentation to do this non-targeted analysis. You can also think of them as time machines. So right now, we can test for up to 75 PFAS compounds individually identified. But what about a year from now, 3 years from now? We find out there's other PFAS compounds that are of maybe more concern to us than the ones we're looking at today. Well, if you had an analysis with this QTOF instrumentation, you have a picture of everything that was or was not in that sample at that time. So 3 years from now, you can go back and look at that data and say, well, is this new compound of concern, was it there? So it can kind of help protect you from future finger pointing too. So with that, I'm at the end. This just kind of shows you a holistic picture of what that analytical tool belt looks like. We've got the targeted PFAS options in the top left. You've got the non-targeted options with the top assay and the total organic fluorine, and then that more sophisticated non-target analysis. And you can see the strengths and the weaknesses of each of these, which they all have a strength and a weakness. And so you'll find oftentimes to improve your site investigations, you're going to need to pull on more than one tool at any given time. And you may use them in a different order depending on what your objectives are at that site. You might start with a top assay and then work your way down to a targeted analysis, or vice versa. You might not want to close out a site until you've done a top assay. You might start with the total organic fluorine for site delineation or just to find your hot spots. So there's a different kind of play that you can use with these methods depending on those objectives. And that's it. Thanks for your time, you guys.
Thank you very much, Taryn. Very interesting. I've got a few questions after all the panelists talk for you. So next is Dr. Dylan Eberle. Dylan, do you have control of the program there?
I believe so. Sorry.
There you go. We can hear you loud and clear.
Beautiful.
Sounds good. All yours.
Great. Well, thank you for the opportunity. I wish I could be there in person, but happy to make this work virtually. So my name is Dylan Eberle. I'm a scientist with Geosyntec Consultants. I've been with the firm for about 5.5 years now. And today I'm going to be discussing the application and interpretation of PFAS forensic techniques. We're going to look at some of the methods that are being used in this rapidly developing practice area, and then discuss some real-world studies to demonstrate the ways in which PFAS forensics are being applied in the real world. Today's talk focuses largely on the use of some of our more simplistic and easy analyte lists and methods. So we're again talking about methodologies that you have available at most commercial labs as standard analyses, including the top assay, but not quite going to that next level of QTOF and non-target analysis. So that was a great little introduction to where we're heading in this talk. So with that, let's get going. So at this point, why do we need PFAS forensics? We've got a 2-day conference on it. It's probably pretty abundantly clear at this point. We have a large family of compounds, somewhere in the neighborhood of 5,000 to 6,000 identified at this point, that have been used in a wide range of products materials across multiple industries. And as a result, they're effectively ubiquitous in the environment. It's cliche at this point, but it bears repeating that the only place we aren't finding PFAS are the places we aren't looking. And as a result, when we detect PFAS in the environment, we increasingly need tools to differentiate sources, timings of releases, define background concentrations, and ultimately determine if the detected PFAS originated from a single source, multiple sources, or if these detections may be representative of a more ubiquitous anthropogenic background that cannot be traced to any sort of distinct process or release. Now, as PFAS forensics emerges as a field, many of the forensic techniques that are being used and established come from previously established methodologies for other complex contaminant mixtures, such as PAHs and PCBs, and we're finding that they are equally applicable to the PFAS family of compounds. In addition, due to the unique chemistry of PFAS, we're also seeing the development of new and novel forensic techniques specific to this emerging class of contaminants. So, when we start any forensic investigation, before we dive into analytical data and calculations, we always want to step back and make sure we do the most basic forensic technique, which is a review of the site and surrounding properties for potential sources. Just as with our phase 1s for classic contaminants, if we feel that we need to look for PFAS, we need to think what types of on-site and or off-site activities could lead to significant PFAS concentrations in sampled media. We know that PFAS can originate from a multitude of sources, but some are more prominent and significant than others. And a list of some common sources are provided on this slide, but of course, this is not exhaustive by any means. We also want to consider what sort of public data may be available. There is some pretty good, easy to access sample data out there that's part of the record that you can potentially investigate and see what's happening in your neighborhood. And when we gather this information, we then basically can construct what I would call our preliminary PFAS CSM to use as a tool, our framework in which we're going to hang any sort of environmental data that we collect. Now, when asked to screen a site, we often want to strategically identify potential background locations in addition to potential source areas that we want to investigate. And we want to do this to help identify potential upgrading and offsite contributions in addition to those potential on-site sources. Given the multitude of potential PFAS sources out there and multiple vectors, we also want to keep in mind what media and what our sampling campaign might look like based on what's nearby. If we are close to a potential coatings facility or factory, air emissions suddenly become something we may be concerned about, and that could affect the soil sampling and groundwater sampling plan we put in place to screen. Ultimately, what this gets at is that a regulator or other entity may only be asking you to sample 3 wells to screen the site for PFAS, but your client may actually be better served if you sample 5 wells and take a sample from the stream and sediment that abuts your property, so that when you get that first chunk of data, you have a more complete picture of what's going on. And if you suspect offsite contributions, you have the ability to potentially demonstrate that from the beginning to make it clear that there are other factors at play. And this can be a huge value for a client if they are compelled to do these sorts of screenings. So when we actually get analytical data, the most basic forensic technique we want to look at is what's called the indicator compound. The idea here is that although many PFAS compounds are effectively ubiquitous, others are more strongly linked to specific production processes and sources, and as a result, they may be used to infer ages and mechanisms of releases when detected in the environment. Particularly useful in this is this idea is particularly useful in distinguishing PFAS manufactured using electrochemical fluorination from those produced using fluorotelomerization. We see distinctly different compounds associated with those 2 major PFAS production processes. And while Some electrochemical fluorination and fluorotelomere precursors will degrade into similar end products, others will not. And that's something we want to keep in the back of our minds when we start talking about some of the more advanced techniques at our fingertips. Now, another tool at our disposal is the comparison of branched and linear isomers in our samples. Now, historically, as I mentioned, PFAS were manufactured using one of two predominant methods, electrochemical fluorination or fluorotelomerization. For lack of a better term, ECF was a much more sloppy chemistry process that produced a mixture of branched and linear PFAS isomers, while the fluorotelomere process produced only linear and even chain PFAS compounds predominantly. So as a result, the analysis of the branched versus linear isomers in a sample, particularly for our C8 compounds, can potentially be used to suggest if the PFOA and PFAS detected in a sample likely originated from the same or different manufacturing processes, which in itself can potentially imply a single or multiple sources. Now, it's important to note that the ratios in the raw materials that were manufactured may evolve and change once they're released in the environment due to preferential absorption, uptake, and volatilization of one isomer over the other, depending on environmental conditions. But this too can be potentially useful in distinguishing older from newer releases, even for materials produced using the same manufacturing process. Now, with that all being said, this technique is strongest when used in combination with other forensic techniques as part of a weight of evidence approach. I would be hesitant to try and hang my entire interpretation just on this information. So let's take a moment now and look back at our common sources and some of the PFAS compounds commonly associated with them. And again, I want to stress that this is not exhaustive nor limiting, but when it comes to fluorochemical manufacturing and coatings application facilities, some of our compounds that we see in a high abundance tend to be our PFOA, our PFNA, as well as our Gen X at a lot of these kind of facilities. When it comes to aqueous fighting foam or film forming foam sites, we've got two major types of foam that have been used, those manufactured using electrochemical fluorination. And in those materials, we would expect to see larger abundances of PFOS and PFHXS. Whereas in foams manufactured using fluorotelomerization, we would expect to see a lot of polyfluorinated compounds, such as 6,2-fluorotelomere sulfonate, as well as some of the terminal end products that those polyfluorinated compounds may degrade into, such as our perfluoropentanoic acid and our perfluorohexanoic acid. When we get to the metal plating industry and some of the mist suppression solutions that were used, the story is very similar. Older formulations tended to be PFAS dominant, whereas newer formulations appear to be polyfluorinated, with 6,2-FTS again being one of the dominant compounds we see in wastewaters coming out of those facilities. Now, when it comes to landfills and wastewater treatment plants, these are, of course, the final repositories for all host of materials, right? But those environments still have some unique signatures that we tend to detect at those facilities at higher frequency than we would in other settings. These include our 5,3-fluorotelomere carboxylic acid, our fluoroalkyl sulfonacetic acids, and our fluorotelomere alcohols. So now that we've looked at indicator compounds, we're looking at the magnitude of individual compounds as sort of a signature of potential sources. We then want to go that next step and start doing some fingerprinting, in which we now are looking at compound ratio analysis. This is where we look at the absolute and relative concentrations of multiple analytes in a sample to form a fingerprint that may be used to compare to different potential sources. We may be comparing to a literature-based source or to other environmental data within a study area. In this example, we can see some AFFF fingerprints associated with different eras of manufacturing. And we can see how the older generations of foams, our electrochemical fluorination-based ones, have a distinctly different signature relative to our fluorotelomere-based foams, which are generally newer formulations. And even within those fluorotelomere foams produced by different manufacturers, we can potentially see differences that may allow us to differentiate them from each other. Now, another way of viewing compound ratio analysis data is, of course, our stacked bar graphs. In this example, we have a hypothetical site where a series of samples have been collected around the edges of our investigation area. And what we have here is the data shown as such. And in this example, we really need 3 graphs to fully evaluate this data and understand what's happening here. When we look at our first graph up here, in the left-hand corner, right away, we can see that this sample, SE number 2, is clearly different than the others simply by virtue of its magnitude of concentration. And we don't want to lose track of that as we start diving into the minutia. Now, when we remove that sample, we can start to see similarity and differences amongst the other samples taken in our study area. We can then, of course, normalize the data so we compare across all samples to gain even further insight. And we can see that there are some similar signatures located to the west and southwest, as well as potentially to the east of our site, whereas in the southeast, we've got two different signatures that suggest potentially impacts from two different sources or processes. Now, of course, we want to always zoom back out and remember, what's the big guy? What's the big dog, if you pardon the phrase? And we don't want to lose track of that in our forensic analyses. The robustness and how much we can say about forensics is always going to be limited by the abundance of the compounds. As we get really, really close to detection limits, the absence of compounds starts to be an issue, because it doesn't necessarily mean they're not there. It's just that we can't measure them. And so we always want to keep that in mind as well when we're looking at environmental data and trying to build these fingerprints. You know, do you have the full fingerprint or concentration so low that you simply can't develop it? Now, another factor that we need to consider, of course, is that different signatures and fingerprints, when we're looking at compound ratio analysis, don't necessarily always mean different sources. Due to different physiochemical properties of individual PFAS compounds, signatures can change as compound mixtures migrate through the environment due to our classic processes of dilution, dispersion, precursor transformation, sorption, as well as additional sources. In our hypothetical example shown here, we have samples collected from an AFFF source zone and a series of down gradient wells. So we got a little schematic here, and then we've got a graph. And so what we have shown here is the relative abundance of each compound on the left axis and the total concentration as shown by a red line graphed on the right-hand axis. And right away, we can see that as we move down gradient, the total concentrations of PFAS in groundwater decrease, and the relative abundance of individual compounds also changes. And that makes sense. Oops, excuse me, didn't want to jump slides just yet. So in our source zone, we have a predominance of 6,2-fluorotelomere sulfonate, shown in our dark blue, and PFOS shown in our orange. And these are good indicators that both ECF and fluorotelomere-based foams have been used. And we can see some evidence of changes associated with that as we move down gradient. Our 6,2-FDS starts to decrease, and we start to see increases in some potential end products, such as our PFHXA, as well as our PFPEA, and that's that conversion of 6,2-FDS into those compounds. In addition, we start seeing a greater abundance of perfluorohexane sulfonic acid, and this is going to be the result of uncharacterized precursors converting into that compound as well. In addition, some of the decreases in PFOS could very well be due to its preferential sorption to aquifer materials. And then our last bit here, as we see the arrival of PFNA at our most down gradient well, this would be a clue that maybe there's another source as we move down gradient, or another signature starting to show up. So this is just a hypothetical example, but showing how a signature can change as you move down gradient from a source, and we want to be keeping that in mind as we interpret environmental data. The last thing I want to say about compound ratio analyses before moving on into some case studies is that one issue we are starting to encounter is that the ever-increasing analyte list that was hinted at in our prior talk. Historic data may have only looked at 7 to 14 compounds, where newer data is looking at much longer analyte lists. And so when you try to compare back to older historic samples, it can lead to issues. In our hypothetical here, we can see that a lot of the samples in our historic sampling of an area look pretty similar, generally speaking. But we can see when a newer sampling is conducted in the same general area, that a compound shown in red, our 6,2-FTS, is really elucidative in distinguishing some of these samples from each other. But we didn't analyze for it in the old sampling. So how confident are we about the similarities or differences that we saw in the past looking at older historic data? And this is just a tough problem that we're going to be wrestling with as we move forward. So some case studies were promised, and now it's time to get into them. So in this example, we've got a groundwater sample collected from a monitoring well at a fire training area. And stakeholders wanted to know if the PFAS profile of this sample suggested that the well had been impacted predominantly by an electrochemical-based AFFF or a fluorotelomere-based AFFF. And the question had some importance because although there was documented storage of newer fluorotellumer-based foam at the site, the use of prior ECF-based foam was unknown. So we take a look at our sample, and right off the bat, we got some strong indications that a lot of the PFAS in the sample, at the very least, originated from an ECF-based foam. Our first hint is that 85% of the detected PFAS in this sample are perfluorosulfonic acids, which are a strong ECF indicator. Our dominant compounds are PFOS and PFHXS, and those are, again, strong indicators of an AFFF of that origin. In addition, it's worth noting that the ratio of those two compounds to each other in this sample is approximately 1:1, whereas in the original formulation, it would probably be closer to 10:1 PFOS to PFHXS. So we have evidence that there's been some weathering of this sample in the environment. Now, with all that being said, we still have some minor detections of fluorotelomers, which should be coming from in a fluorotellumer-based foam. And so with that all being said, this detection of 6,2-FDS suggests that we can't completely discount contributions from a fluorotellumer-based AFFF. It's for this reason. It's possible that this snapshot could be underestimating the potential contribution of fluorotellumer-based foam, as the majority of the readily detectable polyfluorinated precursors, of which we can only sample for a very small amount discretely, may have already degraded to terminal perfluorocarboxylic acids. So a way that we went at trying to maybe capture that or understand whether this was the case was the application of the total oxidizable precursor assay to that sample to try and understand what other PFAS mass may be there that could help elucidate this further. So in this example, one thing we want to make sure we understand before we interpret our top assay data is how these compounds degrade in the environment versus how they degrade under top. And for our ECF-based precursors, and we're looking just at the C6-based ones, in the environment, these compounds can potentially degrade into either perfluorohexanoic acid or perfluorohexane sulfonic acid, so our PFHXA or our PFHXS. But under the top assay, it's really important to note, we are always going to force these precursors to a carboxylic acid. When we look at our fluorotelomers, when these guys degrade, in the environment, we can form perfluoropentanoic acid or perfluorohexanoic acid, both under environmental degradation and top assay conditions. So we've got some important distinguishings here, but it's nuanced to be sure. So now let's look at these results. So the oxidizing agent, we measured our sample, and then an oxidizing agent is applied, and we measure the sample again, and we look for changes, particularly increases in perfluorocarboxylic acids, and we do see that. We can see these increases relative to the original sample, showing that there were precursors in our sample and we converted them. And we can also see that the predominant perfluorocarboxylic acid produced is our PFHXA, along with smaller amounts of perfluorobentanoic acid and perfluoropentanoic acid. So with all that being said, what does this mean? Well, like any good scientist, one of the best places to go is the literature. And so what we did is we looked at the relative abundance of the different perfluorocarboxylic acids produced in our sample when the top assay was applied, and went back to a series of data collected by Houts et al. In 2013, where they took archived AFFF samples, measured them, and then applied the top assay and measured them again. And when we look at the pattern of perfluorocarboxylic acids produced in our sample, we can see that the pattern very closely matches the pattern that we would associate with an ECF-based AFFF, dominated by the production of perfluorohexanoic acid, along with smaller amounts of PFBA and PFPEA. Whereas if this was a fluorotellumer-based foam, or if a fluorotellumer-based foam was the predominant contributor, we would probably expect to see a different signature dominated by perfluoropentanoic acid. So in this case study, we're trying to demonstrate that the top assay can be really useful in differentiating PFAS originating from these two different manufacturing methods. And this is particularly true when you're trying to characterize weathered AFFF signatures. And as you might imagine, in a forensics environment, if you know that one facility used one type of foam and another facility used a different type of foam, this can potentially help elucidate potential source contributions and responsibilities. In our second case study, we have a drinking water supply well with two potential sources in proximity to a coatings application facility, as well as a fire training college. sort of a mocked up CSM here, but basically following PFAS detections in the supply well near a wetlands complex, a regulator basically went to the coatings manufacturing facility and ordered an investigation, basically saying that they had been identified as a potentially responsible party and ordered to conduct a site investigation in response to the detections in the impacted supply well. In addition to that facility, though, the fire college on the other side of this lake and wetlands complex at the time was not asked to investigate. So when constructing our CSM, we knew that the coatings facility was likely not the only potential source. There, as clearly shown in our diagram there. But we couldn't sample the fire college, but we could sample from the lake abutting the wetland complex, getting a surface water sample. And when we looked at the PFAS in that surface water sample relative to the compounds in the drinking water well, as well as an on-site monitoring well, our compound ratio analysis showed a distinct difference between the on-site monitoring wells dominated by PFOA versus the signature that we saw in the lake water, where we see significant quantities of PFOS and PFHXS relative to other constituents, which is of course a potential AFFF indicator. So we've already got some indications here that there may be multiple sources impacting this well, not just one. Taking a weight of evidence approach, we also contacted that analytical lab and used this work to try and, excuse me. So we contacted the analytical lab and used for this work and asked them to see their metadata to try and do a branched linear analysis to see if our hunch was further supported by that tool. And in a word, it did. So in PFOS and PFOA produced using the electrochemical fluorination method, we would expect about 30% of the PFOS to be branched and about 22% of the PFOA to be branched. And what we saw was that the PFOS was very close to sort of what we would expect in a literature value for an ECF-based foam, whereas the PFOA had a different ratio of branch to linear, lower than that, suggesting a potential fluorotelomere-based source. Now, again, this is not conclusive in and of itself, but it added additional credibility to our hunch that the PFOS was likely originating from a different source than the PFOA was originating from. So the lesson here is that a proactive sampling approach helped identify other potential responsible parties within a study area. A review of site history in local area suggested other sources could be contributing, and we were able to help demonstrate this further using compound ratio analysis and an isomer analysis. And about 2 years later, that fire college was asked to investigate, and significant PFAS impacts were discovered at that property, including the potential use of water from the lake as part of firefighting activities and the allowing stormwater discharge back to the lake at the completion of those activities. In our last case study, and we're going to move quick, as part of closure activities at a large industrial facility, a regulator requested a round of PFAS samples as part of just simple due diligence screening as part of their overall program to screen environmental sites within their system. Now, it's important to note that at this particular facility, there were no known operations that would have been expected to have significant PFAS-containing material. Although metal plating may have occurred at locations at the facility, the timeline of facility operations suggests that these operations stopped long before the adoption of potential PFAS-containing mist suppression systems. So a series of wells were sampled, and as you can see, the concentrations were pretty low across all these samples. We're talking about tens to single-digit nanograms per liter at these for PFOS and PFOA, with some of 24 PFAS only getting up to about 67 nanograms per liter. So this all led to the question, do these detections indicate an on-site source or not? To try and answer this question, we did a fingerprint analysis. I'm not going to go through the details of all of these. We basically found that there were about 3 different groupings of samples across the site, but that the pattern really didn't, based on both the signatures and the concentration trends, really didn't indicate a indication of an area that had a distinct process or release, is what we kind of got at. We did see some similar signatures in the area of heavy industrial use, but that's kind of to be expected given the uses of waxes, paints, cleaning products, and packaging. We kind of expect concentrations to be higher in an industrial area, but we didn't see evidence of a distinct release that you might associate with a fire suppression system or a plating area where there's actually a source to actively chase. And when we contextualized our results, the concentrations we see here are very similar to those that we see in stormwater, with higher concentrations observed in an urban area, whereas more rural or less developed areas tend to be a bit lower. And so we were able to sort of demonstrate to the regulator that the patterns and concentrations we were seeing really were not indicative of a distinct source area that required additional investigation. This stuff is everywhere. Concentrations are going to be higher where people are doing things, but they don't always mean that there's a source to chase. And so I'm just going to move along and basically just hit some highlights. So PFAS forensics, and I've just touched the tip of the iceberg on this, is a rapidly developing field, and it's already being utilized to support CSM creation. We've got a lot of cool tools in our toolbox, and that's basically all I got to say at this point. I think the slide speaks for itself. So I thank you for your time, and I look forward to questions at the end of this session.
Thank you so much, Dylan. That was a lot of information in a short period of time. I'm sure we'll have some questions on that, but it does appear with the expansion of the PFAS list with the analytical data that could help support future forensic evaluation. So that's great news. I did want to also point out that we have quite a few posters up and around. Encourage everybody to take a look at those at breaks, and if you have any questions, find the prepare the author and ask away. Our next presentation is by Lucas. He's going to talk a little bit about fire college training down in Miami area. So appreciate it.
Hi, everybody. So I'm Lucas Barroso-Giachetti. I'm the environmental manager for Miami and West Palm Beach for Terracon. So following Taryn and Dylan, it's going to get a little bit more basic here with me. My 23andMe tells me that I'm 3 to 4% Neanderthal. So you're being lectured to by a caveman. Hence, you're going to see a lot of photos in my presentation. But we're mainly going to talk about the assessment of a fire academy and mainly focusing on AFFF, but sort of at the end of it, after we go through the ooh and ah photos and you guys are more entertained, we'll talk about what it means. I think talking back to a little bit of the legal discussion yesterday about where does it stop, right? Okay. So just as an overview, we'll go through the stock PFAS basics because this presentation will be used again. We'll get into the history of the site, which is actually pretty neat. And a lot of cool World War II photos. And the reality is that what we see today is not what was there before. And I think as part of the evolution of how we assess PFAS and how we look at it, that's going to be a key role. And using some of the tools that were, like just talked about. As you can see, that area turned into what is now the Dade College North Campus. Okay, so we'll talk a little bit about that use and why we were there in the first place. And then after that, we'll get into a little bit of the typical blocking and tackling that we have to do on the assessment side, and then we can talk about the data and see what it meant. Oh, crikey. So, we talked about, the typical, all of the background on PFAS and all those low detection levels. So, this is a typical slide. We talked about all of the regulatory environment activity that's going on. A cool thing to do is to show how small parts per trillion is. So if from the distance from the Earth to the sun, it's 6 inches. So we're talking about very, very low levels. So in terms of the history of PFAS, it's been, we talked about a lot here. And what we're finding out is that you have a multiple source scenario. We typically deal with a single source scenario, whether it's a former ag site, you have arsenic. If it's a UST site, you have one source. But here we're really talking about multiple layers, multiple sources. So in this case, we will be focusing on the AFFF, but then we have a historical use that, from what we know about the production of PFAS going back to the 40s, can't come into play. So, like a lot of folks talk about, well, where did we get AFFF? So there's a tragedy that occurred on the USS Forrestal in 1967. So through an electrical, basically error, a problem with the, system on a jet, a Zuni rocket got fired on deck, and that caused an explosion, caused a very bad fire. At the end of that, you had 134 sailors killed. You had 160 injured, and then you had $70 to $80 million worth of damage. Okay, so that was the catalyst for using this AFFF, because they couldn't get the fire down. Okay, so they were losing the fight against the fire. Most of the planes on the carrier were damaged because of that. So there on your bottom right-hand side, you can see an actual AFFF exercise on the USS JFK. So why the shameless Terracon PFAS project map on there? It's because one of the things that we're seeing is that, and this is a Florida-focused perhaps conference, but this is a national issue. And wherever we've done work, we're seeing it everywhere. And then in all those little dots across the country, and we're just one firm doing this work. So if we combine all of the places where we've done assessments, what we're going to find out is that it's everywhere. And that's, I think, is the take-home message that we're getting here these past couple of days. So we know that PFAS is showing up everywhere. And there's luckily been a lot of good work in terms of where it's, what the sources are. And we have some main areas, some main culprits, if you will, of where we're finding it. So in this case, we had 2 strikes with our site. So you had a history of the aircraft operations, military operations, although they were a little bit older, but they did come into play because of the overlap there with the production of the PFAS. And then you had a bona fide active fire training academy. And then within that, I think as we go through these things, we begin to go into sub areas where inside of those areas, where could it also possibly coming in within a setting like an airport, right? So you have, those ops in terms of the aircraft, you have AFFF, places where it's being stored, you can have lines. So you're beginning to get into, again, multi-source, multi-layered type of an assessment and sources. So let's leap back into time. For those of you who are old enough, this is from a show called Quantum Leap. This guy there with the cool leather jacket is Scott Bakula. He used to play Dr. Sam Beckett. This is back when, if you missed the TV show, you couldn't see it again, right? Because that was it. So the site had a really, really long and actually storied history. It's purchased by the Navy in about 1942. Was formerly known as the Naval Air Station Miami, and then NAS Miami South Field number 1. The locals called it Masters Field. And there's a really cool photo there of an FA-8 Bearcat on the field. For all we know, that was on the site. right? So that was sort of what was cool about doing this project, was it just wasn't a fire training academy. It had a long history way before that. And what's a little factoid is that this was going to be the site of Miami International Airport before, I guess, some room was made west of the current MIA now, and it got moved in the 50s. So here's another cool photo of them doing exercises, as you would at any naval air station, marine air station. So it was an active facility. And they retained ownership through the war and after the war. This is a really great, and there's a couple great resources for these historical airfields. You know, there's some folks who do amazing work in terms of getting photos, getting real great interviews from the folks that used to work there, or used to fly there. And this is a great aerial looking east of where you had those naval air station operations. And there on the bottom left-hand side, you can see sort of the, the eastern portion of the site. So in terms of the runways, we were at almost the crosshairs. Okay, so it may have been a different story if you would have had our site more to the east, more towards where Northwest 27th Avenue is now. So the site gets, it's deemed surplus by the government in the late 50s and gets given back to the state. And the state at that point says, okay, let's put Dade Junior College there. And they begin to do the construction of it in the 60s. And then that evolves into what is today, at least in that North Campus, Dade College North Campus. The northwest corner of it is dominated by both the Dade College Fire Academy and also the fire department. I'm sorry, the Florida Department of Law Enforcement Training Facility. And that's where they take trainees and get them into cars and make them drive really, really fast and not crash. They've been training firefighters there since 1982. So it has a long history of them doing this very incredible training for these, these guys and girls who go out there and do a very, very brave job for us. So what we did is, given that history, we did what you have to do in these cases. We sat down with them and said, what do you know? What can you tell us? And I think similar to a lot of other sites that have gone through this process, there was just some recent information, and then it gets fuzzy the more you try to get back into what the ops were in the 80s and in the 90s, okay? What we do know from a PFAS point of view is that they were subject to the same phasing out of the PFAS AFFF in the early 2000s. So we began to know, look, at least you had a couple decades potentially worth of use. So we sat down with them, and this is a cool slide because we have clients that are going to be along at different points of what do I want to know about PFAS now? We had a lot of good discussion yesterday about, to test or not to test. So Dade College they wanted a test. They wanted to know. They wanted to know where we're at. We understand and acknowledge, the history of the site, and we want to know what are those groundwater. I think at that time you already were beginning to see a lot of the assessments there in early 2019 of a lot of the fire academies. So in preparation, we did what you had to do for these types of projects. We did a detailed sampling plan, okay, to make sure that everything was in place, from us down to drillers, down to anybody that was in contact, literally in physical contact with the project. And there's a lot of cotton involved when you're sampling there for PFAS. So, and just as critical was to sit down with staff and really get their knowledge on where exactly were the burn areas? What did the operations look like? What would that look like after they put out the fire? So, there's a good figure where we try to overlay both things that were related to the AFFF activity and also site features, open ground. I like to deal with, in Miami, you deal with stormwater as part of life there. And what does that mean to your investigation? And I think a lot of times it can have a huge factor hydraulically as to what's going on there. And if you have things going into a French drain and they're going in one direction and the other, what does that mean? So we tried to sort of incorporate all those layers, right, which is a theme sort of as we go through. And what we decided to do was to do a screening. So, the first step was to say, let's see what's there. And so we limited it to basically 7 silt borings and 7 temp wells. And yes, we did analyze the top 6 inches, which is a big deal. So in terms of the results, as we get here a little bit into the data, we saw what I think is, what we're seeing is pretty typical at a lot of these sites. So we failed leachability, right? So PFAS is the new dieldrin. We failed leachability in soils, but it was well below a very high standard in terms of the residential provisional CTL. That was a different story with the groundwater. So there you did see some pretty significant levels in the shallow groundwater. So that forced us to move, as we're mandated by 780, to go a little bit more laterally and see what's going on a little bit deeper. So, the caveman yellow arrows show you where we went in terms of where we could go. Okay, so I think also with these sites, we had, both some limitations in terms of the real estate. Where can we sample? Where is it okay for us to sample? And then we obviously couldn't put a well in the middle of the FDLE training facility where we were going to literally get run over by a car, right? Not good. So we wanted to also see what's going to be the migration of this stuff. And really 200 feet, in what we're talking about with these contaminants, 200 feet may not be a lot. So we wanted to see what that meant. So we went ahead and also did a deeper well, about 30 to 35, and see what that vertical migration was there in the water column. So, hey, David, can you cue up the, let's give life to the avocado, as I call it. So what we saw was that the shallow plume correlated pretty strongly with the AFFF training area, right? You have all those high concentrations right there. And I think one of the things, whether it's using modeling or using CPT, we're going to have to get creative in terms of interpolating data, because we're not going to be able to get as much data as we really want to, even as the methods continue to evolve and the cost continues to get better. We're going to have to use these tools. So, what it looks like is that you have what we're seeing in other places is, you're going to have to assess a little bit deeper here. And so that's going to be a common theme, I think, at a lot of PFAS sites, is that you're going to have to assess it vertically like we do with, a former dry cleaner site, PCE or TCE. And then we're going to have to talk about, I think, in the future, what are the dotted products, right? So in the same way that we all know by memory, PCE, TCE, and it ends up at vinyl chloride, we're going to begin to know that story. Maybe in 5 years, we'll have a set story for that too. So in summary, what did the data show us? You had, not surprisingly, some pretty significant shallow groundwater impacts. But it seemed to be really focused around where these guys were doing heavy training, burning stuff up in multiple areas. And not surprisingly, over 2 decades of potential use, that's where it was mainly centered. Now, it did get a little bit better as you got away from it, and it looks like you could probably see it going down to 30 to 50 feet. Now, one of the things that happened, because this is this is about a year and a half old presentation. So in between now and then, in late 2020, Durham did do a background study in Dade County. So we obviously wanted to look at that and what it meant to us in terms of our data. So just to summarize their study, they took the county and they split it into north, central, and south. It sort of echoes what they did with arsenic a little bit, right? And they mainly looked at, I think what we would look at if we were in that chair, they looked at different land uses, different densities population-wise. They looked at septic tanks, which I think is a smart play, because that's going to be, as we're beginning to understand that it's everywhere and it can come from anywhere, what does that mean? Certainly for a shallow groundwater environment like Dade County. So what they found in their testing, and what I'm showing there in that one line is what they did in northern Dade County. Okay, so there's more samples that they did in the central and in the southern portions, okay? And the means were below the 70 HAL level, provisional CTL. But within that data set, you saw that you had some numbers that were above 70 and into the hundreds. So what you can see in the data, at least in their means, and obviously we're not talking about ends in the hundreds or anything, that it's there, right? And it varies based on location. So it's certainly been very helpful to have that from them, because we were able to look at our data and then as we stepped out, see what it meant once we got away from our AFFF hot zone, right? The hot part of the avocado. And what we saw is that when we took all of our data, we were actually at a 300 mean. So obviously that didn't correlate. But when we took away those core wells in the AFFF area, we were at a mean at 14 to 15. So we were in line with some of the means that these guys were seeing in the general North Dade County area. So we begin to have that talk about, okay, what's my PFAS and what's our PFAS, right? So, at the end of the day, we wanted to understand if we had PFAS, where did it come from? Was it all from us? Did the history play a part in it? In terms of the site having multiple, like uses, which is going to be a factor, I think, in a lot of sites. There's no doubt that within the main AFFF training area, you have a bona fide plume that you're going to have to deal with. But then as you stepped away from it, not by much, 200 feet, 250 feet, you began to get into what may be, and it's early, okay? So these, like to use the term background officially, I think we can't do that yet based on that study, but it's going towards that. So I think as we keep working on these sites, just like we do in Dade County, those of us that deal with arsenic and soils, we have to do 95 UCLs and see which is my arsenic and which is the arsenic that's been there sub-regionally for 100 years. We're gonna have to maybe do that same calculus. Just as my own sanity check, I looked at some of the sites that DP was doing, not nearby, but again, similar histories, maybe not having a naval air station there for 20 years, but we saw similar results, right? You had leachability, failures in the soil, and you had shallow groundwater impacts, although ours were a little bit higher. And I think that may have been a function of the use of those facilities in terms of age. So I think at a minimum, we provided both MDs, both Dade College and both DEP and Golder, who's going to be moving forward with the site, with a good basis to move forward. So I just want to give thanks to Dade College for their support. in there, also to DEP, both to Phillips and to Jeff Newton. Also thanks to Eurofins for all the help during the project, and to Dan Schneider, with us at Terracon, who was a great help during the project. Okay, so thank you very much.
Excellent presentation. Lucas, we appreciate also the information about the background study that's going to be very key to future PFAS investigations. I will mention we're working on one fire training facility in Florida where somebody mentioned confining units yesterday, and this site has a surficial, it's got a probably 30 to 40 foot hawthorn clay, pretty consistent, but PFAS is down to 275 feet. Somehow I made it through that clay. So vertical delineation is going to be challenging in Florida. So, next up, we've got Fabio and Nick from HSW talking about conceptual site models using practical applications. So go for it.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you. Let's see how to work this.
It's not easy.
It's not easy. So, as we are looking here at all the presentations, we know that when we're going to start the investigation your site, and the PFAS, it's your contaminant of concern. We have at least we have 4 industry that is well known that we can, if your site is nearby or is within this type of industry, probably going to have some type of PFAS contamination. As no, sure, if it's a manufacturer industry that has DuPont, 3M, or any other industry that use PFAS in the past, industry that use firefighter foams, AAA as firefighter facilities, airports, military bases. Of course, all this waste management industry include landfill, open dump, and everything that accumulated waste with PFAS, and this can leachate by the leachate go to the soil and groundwater. And in the wastewater treatment, as you see, the wastewater treatment can be punctual release in the water, in the rivers, and also use a biosolid. The application, the farming, and everything, yes, is a concern, and this it's what we know. But what about we are not sure yet? So yes, we have the hose house products, clean products. So perhaps your garage, it's a PFAS source. I think someone mentioned in the presentation about car wash. That yes, a concern, but still not everybody know about. I was reading an article about the waxing that you put in the ski. So all these facilities, ski resorts during the summer when there's no melt, these PFAS can percolate in the soil and groundwater. And of course, dry cleaning and the laundry facilities, because all this contact with clothes that is treated with PFAS, mainly waterproof clothes. About these specific dry cleaning facilities, Florida Department of Environmental Protection, FDP, they came to us in the beginning of 2019, and they came to us with, they contracted us, of course, they asked us 2 simple questions. So first, are PFAS impact its present and dry cleaning sites? And it's affirmative, it's yes. Are PFAS impact is associated with the dry cleaning operation, or they came from off-site, some off-site source? And for this, we create a hypothesis. before start our investigation, that our hypothesis is, okay, we don't believe that PFAS came from the raw dry clean solvent, the PCE, but we believe that came from these raw material with contact with the clothes or the other type of product to use the operation. And we divide our investigation into phases. So the first phase, it was the initial screen. So FDP together with us, we selected 15 dry cleaning sites under the dry cleaning program, FDP dry cleaning program. And all the sites had in common that has or had in the past are impacted by dry cleaning solvents, more specifically impacted by PCE. So we got our car, we drove our truck, we drove from the North Florida and what's the name of the city in the north? Pensacola until Miami. And in the all 15 dry cleaning sites, we collected 2 groundwater samples from the existing monitor wells. Normally, the 2 that has a high elevated contamination by PCE. Normally, one inside the facility close to the dry cleaning machine and in the back of the facility. And we analyze all this for PFAS, all this groundwater sampling. And as results, bingo, between 15 sites, 10 sites, we got the sum of PFOA and the PFOS above the provisional GCTL that here in Florida said 70 nanograms per liter. All right, and this is the overview of the 10 sites. Most of the sites still are current, is active dry cleaning sites. All the sites use PCE as the dry cleaning solvent in the one part of the process, or still use the PCE, and some sites change for petrol-based solvent that's a little bit more environment friendly. And most of the sites also had or have been under a type of remediation target the PCE, the VOC compounds. All right, and now we have in the hands 10 sites. Okay, what's the next step? The next step is come back over there and try to figure out where it comes from. So our second phase, it was the expanded site assessment. That first we work more in the office. We try to see in the radius of 1 mile from each site, everything, all the information that you can collect, all the sites of concern, like the 4 principal sites that I explained at the beginning of the presentation. As well, we try to see everything, all the contamination site by the state or by Superfund, everything possible that you can put in the map together with the historical of the groundwater flow. We understand what it's up gradient and the down gradient. We're going to explain a little bit more in the next slide. We have been in the field between June 2019 until December of last year. So it was a long, good time traveling through Florida. And during this period, we collect around 450 samples of soil, of groundwater, and we install some monitor wells where we think that is necessary. And normally we try to first, objective, it was collect the samples to areas of concern of the release of the material, the waste from dry cleaners. That's normally, it's close to the dry cleaning machine, or, as I said, in the back of the facility, some drain field, everything that, every place that have concern. Also, we try to delineate or try to understand the fate transportation of the PFAS. We collect sample, of course, for use the PFAS analysis, and to gather some samples with VOH to try to understand if VOH and PFAS has some similar pattern or something that can help us to understand. Nick Burns is going to talk a little bit with the results of our second phase. Thank you.
Yeah, so as Fabio said, based on the initial screening that we conducted, we determined that there was PFAS impacts above the provisional GCTLs. And so our next phase tried to answer the question, is it coming from the dry cleaners or from an offsite source? And so we initially, before going back out into the field, we did some background research, both in the site vicinity, looking at various industries or other potential sources, using available public information. And we also looked further into, at the subject site, looking at the site background, potential former uses of that site, and along with site geology and hydrogeology and depth of water, groundwater flow direction, along with relevant site features such as septic tank or sanitary sewer information, stormwater drainage or discharge, and reclaimed water use in the general areas. We use that information to prepare a sampling plan that we felt would help us in our investigation. Along with that, we reviewed the current existing monitoring well construction details, and actually proposed to install some additional wells, generally at up gradient or side gradient locations, because we're trying to find out whether PFAS is coming from these sites or from an up gradient or offsite source, as we know that the PCE is most likely related to the dry cleaner. Based on the ubiquitous nature of PFAS, we knew we would probably have to use multiple lines of evidence to show or find our answer. So in addition to the actual PFAS concentrations, we looked at the PFAS distribution patterns, along with the groundwater flow direction. This particular map doesn't show the concentrations, but it shows some distribution patterns, where we can tell that there is some offsite contributions, but we were able to show that there is PFAS related to the subject property. And at this particular site, there was a septic tank and drain field, which exhibited elevated concentrations of PFAS. This chart just shows some of our results. A couple things about this. We were focusing on PFOS and PFOA to compare to the provisional CTLs, but we are seeing lots of different PFAS compounds. And another thing to point out is that we are seeing PFAS above the provisional CTLs, but they would be much lower than what you might see at a AAA or triple AF site. So we found PFAS in soil and groundwater from the low PPT to the low PPB levels. So after we conducted our assessment, our expanded assessments at these 10 sites, and could tell that PFAS was coming from the subject properties, we want to find out where that PFAS was actually coming from. And so we expanded to a third phase where we actually sampled different products within the dry cleaning process. We also prepared and provided questionnaires to the current facility operators to help provide some additional information regarding their operations, different types of solvents that they use currently, different machines or pre-spotting materials that they use. And we looked at the different potential sources of PFAS in the dry cleaning process, such as, like I said, the pre-treatment spotting materials, the new solvent or detergents used, possibly coming from the clothes themselves, along with, and then collected samples of the waste materials and separated water materials. And these show some of our results from that waste stream sampling. Although all dry cleaners have a general business practice that is similar, each individual facility operates a little bit differently. So we were not able to collect the same samples at each particular site. And one thing to note, well, a couple things to note here, we're not comparing these concentrations to the actual CTLs. This was just to get an idea of where we're seeing PFAS in the different sample locations. And as you can see here, in some of the waste, we are seeing elevated PFAS or PFOS and PFOA, whereas in most of the raw materials, we're not seeing anything or actually much lower. The final thing about this particular slide is that we found that most of the dry cleaners do not carry raw solvent at their facility. They have the dry cleaning solvent delivered to their site and put it into the machine and begin using it right away. So some of our findings, we did not see a strong correlation between PCE or VOHs and the PFAS, which may be related to different release patterns or the timing of releases or the prior VOH remediation efforts. And we did see that the behavior of the PFAS was different than the PCE. We did not see a lot of vertical migration of the PFAS at these sites, whereas PCE would migrate vertically. And then, like I said, we did not see a lot of PFAS in the raw materials that we did sample. And so that supported our hypothesis that the PFAS found at the dry cleaners is coming from the contact with PFAS containing clothes or materials. And finally, as I said, we were not able to get a lot of raw solvent materials, so we are going to refine our CSM or bolster our CSM to collect additional raw solvent samples going forward. And with that, we can take questions.
Great presentation, yet another source of more PFAS compounds. Dry cleaning sites, just what we need, right? So we've got about 10 minutes left for Q&A. So I would ask anybody in the audience or virtual, we have some virtual ones. Okay, David, do you have a question?
Yes, I believe that's me. I kind of asked part of this question yesterday, but it seems appropriate for this panel to get their take. I've seen some evidence to suggest that vapor could be a concern for PFAS, though it's kind of theoretical. My question would be, is there evidence to actually suggest that vapor into building could be a concern from PFAS? And if so, is there evidence to show that it could be a threat to human health, which I would assume would impact phase 1 findings a little bit more? And then kind of like a second part would be in terms of phase 1s, when we're thinking about PFAS, to what extent would be the recommendation as far as where to look? Is it more appropriate currently to look just on site or adjacent or off site, and to what extent do we think that that's feasible?
Taryn?
So I can speak to the vapor question. These chemicals are generally thought of as semi-volatile, but there are volatile and even highly volatile PFAS chemicals. But their vapor pressures are generally not documented like they are with, say, VOCs. So we are just in the very beginning stages of trying to collect that data and determine if these chemicals have the necessary volatility to, say, migrate through the vadose zone, pose vapor intrusion risk, and the like. So that research is being done, but it's just at the very beginning stages. So we don't have answers to those questions yet.
I was going to ask Nick the question about RECs and phase ones and PFAS. Have you run across any potential vapor intrusion issues with PFAS sites in phase ones?
Yeah, vapor intrusion is not part of the standard. Vapor encroachment is. Once we talk about it getting into the building, it's an OSHA issue, not a CERCLA issue. So where vapor comes in is vapor encroachment, meaning it's crossed the line and been released to your site, for example, from a neighboring site or from contamination that started on your property. And I don't view vapor any differently than surface, groundwater, soil, sediment. If it's a media that you believe is, a vehicle that has resulted in an impact that's greater than de minimis, meaning that a regulatory agency would be seeking enforcement, or if there's a threat to human health and welfare, then you could, if you believed it was likely, you could call it a REC. But as I said, I don't think I would be in support of creating RECs that don't need to be created. So hopefully there was something else that was driving it, not just your concern about a PFAS migrating over across the property line.
Perfect. Thank you all. Question over here by the gentleman.
Yeah. Just some observations. One paper will talk about PFAS diving, and another paper, and Lucas talked about, he got at Miami Dade in the fire training place. You had a deep plume. You guys said yours was only at the surface. Does it sink or not? And are we talking about different daughter products? What some sink and some don't. Some of the papers talk about it not wanting to adhere to soil, and other talked about it wanting to adhere to soil. Are we talking about the different daughter products, or are we still researching, still asking questions?
I'll take a quick stab at that. So it's going to go back to your conceptual site model. How much source you have to document, all the way to the top of the groundwater. Is that 3 or 4 feet, or is that 20, 25 feet? And does your soil extend all the way down to that interface? Because we've heard talks that like to really hang out at the air-water interface. So, if you've got it at that interface, you could have a source leaching. But does it dive? I don't think the density is all that different than water. So I have heard about diving plumes, but do you have other influences? Do you have production wells in the area that could be influencing its migration vertically?
Hydrogeology in general, yeah.
Or the geology in general. Any other comments on kind of the diving vertical aspects?
Yeah, I think local hydrology is going to dominate a lot there.
Okay.
Yeah. Sir, Drew?
Drew Baird, FRX. My question's for our remote presenter, Dr. Eberle, who I believe is in Massachusetts. Dylan, if you're jealous of us being in Florida, it's about 48 degrees in the conference room. So it's about temperature that you are right now, I think. My question for you is about the evolution of signatures that you showed, and showed differences in concentration spatially as you march down the plume. And you invoked some mechanisms like dilution, product transformation, preferential sorption. What tools currently exist, or maybe they don't, to be able to help determine or at least provide insight as to which of those mechanisms are most dominant or prevalent in the data you showed?
Oh, you're on mute, Dylan.
Yeah, you're still muted.
Sorry, we can't hear you.
He says he's unmuted on his end.
Say again.
He said that he's unmuted on his end, so I don't know if it's.
David?
I'm sorry, I told the conference room spirits that it was cold in here. Just jinxed us.
Say again.
Clearly dodging the question.
Hi, Dylan. I've got you on speaker on my cell phone, so the backup.
Do you have a horrible echo? Or are we all right?
I think we can hear you great.
To Drew's question, I think those tools that would be accessible for a more wide group of practitioners are in the process of being developed. I think it's a really rapidly developing area. I would expect some forensic white papers and publications and practice to be coming out in the near future. It is a challenge. I wish I could be more specific than that, but I think the major thing right now is a lot of it is just as a practitioner myself, it's been looking at this stuff for a while and understanding what can happen. So unfortunately, I don't have a great answer for you. I don't think there are great tools out there beyond just really getting entrenched in the literature and looking at the evolution at these sites. But I would expect in the next 2 to 3 years, we would probably start seeing some more guidance documents and instructional type tools to emerge. So that's probably the best I have.
Great. Thank you. Any other questions virtually or in the room? Okay.
Real quick for lunch, for those of you, as you'll notice in the program, lunch is on your own today. We didn't budget this.